Welcome to Void of Fears, where the line between reality and nightmares blur with every tale. What you're about to hear has happened to someone, somewhere, perhaps even someone just like you. Our community continues to grow, and now we're reaching for 100,000 subscribers. If these glimpses into the unknown call to you, please consider subscribing. Now let's dive into tonight's story. The package arrived on a Thursday morning in October 2024, sitting innocuously among the usual stack of research requests and technical manuals that cluttered Dr. Lisa Grant's desk at the Johnson Space Center. As NASA's lead archivist, she was accustomed to receiving mysterious items from former employees, amateur historians, and conspiracy theorists convinced they possessed the smoking gun that would rewrite space exploration history. Most of the time, these packages contain nothing more than blurry photographs, faded documents, and the desperate hopes of people who wanted to believe that the universe held secrets beyond their mundane existence. But this package was different. The moment Lisa's fingers made contact with the worn brown paper, a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the October weather outside her Houston office. The sensation was immediate and inexplicable, as if the package itself was radiating some form of energy that her body recognized on a cellular level. The box was heavier than it appeared, wrapped in brown paper that felt unnaturally oily beneath her fingers, leaving a residue that she couldn't seem to wash away no matter how many times she rubbed her hands together. There was no return address, no shipping label from any recognizable courier service, no postmark to indicate where it had originated. It had simply appeared on her desk sometime between her departure the previous evening and her arrival that morning, as if materialized from the ether of government bureaucracy. The security cameras in the building showed no delivery personnel, no unauthorized access, nothing that could explain how the package had found its way to her specifically. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper that crumbled at a touch like ancient parchment, was a film canister that looked like it had been buried for decades. The metal was tarnished and pitted with corrosion, bearing the unmistakable scars of time and deliberate neglect. Strange discolorations marred the surface, patterns that almost looked like symbols, if she stared at them long enough. The label, written in faded blue ink, that she recognized as the standard NASA archival notation from the late 1960s, read Apollo 11, EVA Contingency Footage, classified. Below that, scrawled on a torn piece of paper in handwriting that shook with either advanced age or uncontrollable fear, was a note that made her blood run cold. They told us to forget. We can't anymore. The truth needs to see daylight before it's too late. The dreams won't stop. They're coming for all of us. Find Tom Davis. He'll remember. He has to remember. Time is running out. Lisa set the canister on her desk and stared at it for several minutes, her mind racing through possibilities and implications. Apollo 11 contingency footage was the stuff of legend among space historians, whispered about in academic circles and conspiracy forums, with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Everyone knew that NASA had strict protocols for documenting everything that went wrong during missions, every malfunction, every deviation from planned activities, every moment of potential crisis. But most of that material had been declassified decades ago, released to researchers and the public as part of the agency's commitment to transparency. This canister bore classification codes she'd never seen before, alphanumeric sequences that seemed to predate the modern system entirely. The codes were etched into the metal itself, not printed on labels, suggesting a level of security that went far beyond standard operating procedures. As she examined the markings more closely, she noticed that some of them appeared to have been deliberately obscured, scratched out with what looked like a sharp instrument, as if someone had tried to hide the canister's true origin. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone and dialed the number she'd memorized years ago, but rarely used. The number belonged to Tom Davis, one of the last surviving members of the original Apollo program, a man who had dedicated his youth to putting humans on the moon and his later years to guarding the secrets that came with that achievement. Tom answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the weight of 8 decades of life and 40 years of keeping NASA's deepest secrets. The years had been kind to his mind, but harsh on his body, and Lisa could hear the exhaustion in his voice even through the static of the old phone connection. "Tom, it's Lisa Grant. I need you to come to the archive immediately. I've got something that's going to turn your world upside down." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled with the kind of silence that spoke of old fears being awakened. When Tom finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What kind of something, Lisa?" "Apollo 11 contingency footage. Classification codes I've never seen. And Tom, there's a note. Someone wanted me to find you specifically." The silence that followed was even longer, and Lisa could hear the old man's breathing becoming more laboured. When he spoke again, there was something in his voice that she'd never heard before. Genuine terror. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Lisa, whatever you do, don't watch that footage alone, and don't let anyone else know you have it. Not yet." Tom Davis had worked on the original Apollo missions as a young engineer, fresh out of MIT, full of dreams about conquering the cosmos and pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. In those days, he'd believed that space exploration was humanity's destiny, that the stars held answers to questions that they hadn't even learned to ask yet. The Apollo program had been more than a job. It had been a calling, a chance to participate in the greatest adventure in human history. Now, at 78, he moved slowly through the corridors of the Johnson Space Center, his aluminum cane tapping against the polished floors as he made his way to Lisa's office. The building had changed dramatically since his early days, expanded and modernized with each passing decade, but the smell was the same. Ozone from electronic equipment, industrial strength coffee that could dissolve metal, and the faint chemical tang of rocket fuel that seemed to permeate every NASA facility like a ghostly reminder of humanity's reach toward the stars. The younger employees he passed in the hallways looked at him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Most of them knew who he was, at least by reputation. Tom Davis, one of the last links to the golden age of space exploration, a man who had been there when humanity first set foot on another world. What they didn't know were the things that kept him awake at night, the memories that he'd spent 5 decades trying to forget. When he saw the canister sitting on Lisa's desk, his face went white. The colour drained from his weathered features so quickly that Lisa thought he might collapse. He sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk, his hands shaking as he reached for the artifact with the careful reverence of someone handling a live explosive. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, turning the canister over in his weathered hands. His fingers traced the classification codes with the familiarity of someone who had seen them before, long ago, in a different lifetime. Anonymous delivery, no return address, no explanation. Lisa watched his face carefully, noting how his eyes seemed to recognize not just the codes but something deeper about the canister itself. "Tom, what aren't you telling me? You've seen these markings before, haven't you?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying the markings with the intensity of a man trying to remember a half-forgotten nightmare. His breathing had become shallow, and Lisa noticed that his hands were trembling more than she'd ever seen them. "The stock is right," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Everything matches 1969 specifications perfectly. The metal composition, the threading on the cap, even the particular shade of tarnish and corrosion. But Lisa, these classification codes..." He paused, his finger tracing the faded numbers with something approaching reverence. "I haven't seen these in over 50 years. They were part of a compartmentalized system that was supposedly discontinued after Apollo 11, a system so classified that most people didn't even know it existed. What kind of compartmentalized system? Tom's eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her stomach clench with dread. It was the look of a man who had seen things that human beings weren't supposed to see, who had been carrying secrets that were slowly eating him alive from the inside. The kind they used for things that were never supposed to exist. Things that would fundamentally change humanity's understanding of our place in the universe. Things that certain people decided the world wasn't ready to know. They moved to the restoration room, a sterile chamber filled with state-of-the-art digitization equipment that could coax images from film stock so degraded it looked like burnt toast. The room was Lisa's sanctuary, a place where she had spent countless hours breathing life back into forgotten moments of space history, preserving humanity's greatest achievements for future generations. But she'd never felt the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to emanate from the canister as they prepared to open it. The air in the room felt thick, almost viscous, as if the very molecules were reluctant to allow the canister to be opened. The normally bright fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, casting shadows that moved and shifted in ways that defied the laws of physics. Even the background hum of the electronic equipment sounded different, taking on an almost organic quality that made Lisa's skin crawl. The film inside was in remarkably good condition, despite the canister's external appearance of decades-old neglect. As they loaded it into the digitization equipment, Lisa noticed that Tom's hands were shaking more than usual, his normally steady engineer's fingers fumbling with equipment he'd used hundreds of times before. When she asked if he was all right, he just shook his head and muttered something about old ghosts coming back to haunt him, about sins that could never be forgiven. The first frames appeared on the monitor, and both of them unconsciously held their breath. What they saw defied every piece of Apollo 11 documentation Lisa had ever studied, challenged every assumption she'd made about humanity's first steps on another world. There were Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, their bulky white spacesuits clearly visible against the stark black and grey landscape of the lunar surface. The image quality was surprisingly good for 1969 technology, suggesting that this footage had been shot with equipment far more advanced than what was publicly acknowledged to exist at the time. But this wasn't footage from any EVA Lisa had catalogued in her years of archival work. The astronauts were moving away from the lunar module, their movements purposeful and deliberate, heading towards something beyond the camera's initial field of view. "This is impossible," Lisa whispered, her voice tight with disbelief. Every second of their time on the lunar surface was documented. Every step, every movement, every photograph, every soil sample. The timeline is accounted for down to the minute. Tom leaned closer to the screen, his face pale and drawn. "Check the timestamp." Lisa enhanced the frame and felt her world tilt sideways. The timestamp showed July 20th, 1969, 20 hours, 17 minutes and 40 seconds GMT. The exact beginning of the famous 2-minute radio silence, a period that had spawned countless conspiracy theories over the decades but had never been satisfactorily explained. NASA's official explanation had always been a routine technical issue, a minor glitch in the communication systems that was quickly resolved with no impact on the mission. But here was footage from those missing 2 minutes. Footage that showed the astronauts engaged in activities that had never been reported to Mission Control or documented in any of the thousands of pages of mission reports that Lisa had studied. The audio was heavily distorted, filled with strange harmonics that seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. The static wasn't random, it had a pattern, a cadence that reminded Lisa of breathing or a heartbeat. It took several minutes of filtering and enhancement before they could make out the voices beneath the interference, and when they did, Lisa felt ice water flowing through her veins. "Houston, we're seeing structures." Armstrong's voice crackled through the static, but there was something in his tone that Lisa had never heard in any of the official recordings. Fear. Raw, primal terror that no amount of astronaut training could mask. "Repeat, we are seeing structures. They appear to be artificial in nature. Geometric. Definitely not natural formations." Lisa turned up the volume, straining to hear Mission Control's response. In every other piece of Apollo 11 audio she'd ever analysed, the communication between the astronauts and Houston was constant, professional, reassuring. There was nothing. No acknowledgement, no questions, no indication that anyone in Houston was receiving the transmission. The audio track contained only the astronauts' increasingly agitated voices and that haunting, rhythmic static that seemed to pulse like a massive, sleeping heartbeat. "Houston, do you copy?" Aldrin's voice joined Armstrong's, tinged with growing panic. "We're approaching the structures now. They're massive, Neil. These things are huge." Still no response from Mission Control. It was as if the astronauts were completely cut off from Earth, alone on the surface of an alien world, with no way to call for help or guidance. As the footage continued, Lisa and Tom watched in growing horror as the astronauts approached what initially appeared to be a large crater, but the longer they stared at it, the more wrong it looked. The edges were too smooth, too deliberately carved. The shadows fell in patterns that defied the moon's known topography, creating geometric shapes that spoke of intelligence and purpose. The formation was surrounded by smaller structures that looked almost like buildings or monuments, arranged in patterns that suggested urban planning on a scale that dwarfed human cities. "My God," Tom breathed, his voice barely audible. What were they investigating? This wasn't in any of the mission plans. This wasn't supposed to happen. The astronauts moved closer to the formation, and the camera angle shifted to reveal the true scope of what they'd discovered. It wasn't a crater at all. It was an entrance carved into the lunar surface with geometric precision that spoke of advanced engineering, a mathematical understanding that surpassed human capabilities. The opening was massive, easily large enough to accommodate a vehicle the size of the lunar module, and it descended into darkness that seemed to swallow their suit lights like a hungry mouth. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. As Armstrong and Aldrin approached the entrance, their movements began to change. What had started as cautious professional exploration became something else entirely. Their steps grew longer, more purposeful, as if they were being drawn by some invisible force. Their body language changed from scientific curiosity to something approaching compulsion. "They're not in control anymore," Lisa whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Look at the way they're moving. It's like they're being guided." The helmet cameras captured everything in stark detail as the astronauts descended into the opening. Their suit lights illuminated walls that were clearly not natural rock formations. Intricate patterns had been carved into the stone, symbols and designs that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. The symbols appeared almost hieroglyphic in nature, but they bore no resemblance to any Earth-based writing system Lisa had ever encountered. They were beautiful in an alien way, mathematically precise yet organic in their flow and movement. "Tom, are you seeing this?" she asked, but when she turned to look at him, his face had gone ashen. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the restoration room. "I've seen those symbols before," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Not the footage, but the symbols. In my dreams, Lisa. I've been dreaming about them for 55 years. Every night, the same symbols, the same patterns. I thought I was going insane." The tunnel system was vast, a network of passages that had been carved with mathematical precision into the moon's subsurface. The engineering was impossible by human standards, suggesting technologies and capabilities that Earth civilization wouldn't achieve for centuries, if ever. The walls pulsed with their own dim, sickly light that seemed to emanate from within the rock itself, as if the stone had been infused with some form of bioluminescent energy. As the astronauts moved deeper into the tunnel system, their suit radios picked up sounds that defied explanation. Whispers, in languages that predated human civilization, rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and underneath it all, a low thrumming that felt more like a vibration than a sound. The deeper they went, the more intense these sounds became, until they formed a cacophony that should have been overwhelming, but instead seemed to draw the astronauts forward like moths to a flame. The deeper they went, the more organic everything appeared. What had seemed like simple geometric patterns at the entrance revealed themselves to be something far more disturbing. The walls weren't just carved, they were grown, shaped by intelligence that understood the fundamental structure of matter itself. The patterns flowed like living tissue, pulsing with that same rhythm that permeated the audio feed. Then came the chamber. The tunnel opened into a vast underground cathedral, its dimensions so large that the astronauts' lights couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling. The scale was breathtaking and terrifying, suggesting that whatever had built this place operated on a level of engineering that made human achievements look like children's toys. But what filled the space made Lisa's blood turn to ice. Arranged in perfect geometric patterns throughout the chamber were objects that looked disturbingly biological, despite being clearly ancient. They were roughly humanoid, in shape but wrong in proportions that hurt to look at directly. Some were tall and elongated, others squat and broad, but all of them shared the same unsettling quality of being almost but not quite familiar. They pulsed with the same rhythm as the static in the audio feed, as if everything in this place was connected to some vast sleeping consciousness. Armstrong's voice cut through the whispers and static, raw with a terror that no amount of training could contain. Jesus Christ, Buzz, they're not dead. These things, whatever they are, they're not dead. They're sleeping. God help us, they're all sleeping. Aldrin's response was barely audible, his voice shaking with a fear that transcended the physical. Neil, we need to get out of here. Now. Something's watching us. I can feel it in my head. But as they turned to leave, the footage revealed something that made Lisa gasp audibly. The entrance they'd used to descend into the chamber was gone. Where there had been an opening, where they had descended just minutes before, now there was only solid rock, seamlessly integrated with the rest of the wall, as if the tunnel had never existed. The astronauts were trapped. What followed was 47 minutes of the most terrifying footage Lisa had ever witnessed. The astronauts searched frantically for another exit while the whispers grew louder and the pulsing light from the walls intensified. Their oxygen levels were dropping steadily, their movements becoming more panicked with each passing minute. The sleeping figures in the chamber began to stir, not moving but somehow becoming more present, more aware of the intruders in their domain. The helmet cameras captured details that became more disturbing with each frame. The figures weren't wearing clothing or equipment. Their bodies seemed to be partially integrated with the chamber itself, connected by organic-looking tubes and filaments that pulsed with the same light as the walls. Some of the figures appeared to be holding objects that might have been tools or weapons, but their function was incomprehensible to human understanding. And then, just as their suits' life support systems began to emit warning signals, just as Armstrong's breathing became laboured and Aldrin's voice cracked with desperation, a new tunnel opened in the chamber wall. Not carved or blasted, but simply materialised, as if the rock itself had decided to part and create a passage. The opening appeared with a soft sound like breathing, and beyond it, they could see the faint glow of the lunar surface. "They're letting us go," Aldrin whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and dread. "But why? What do they want from us?" The astronauts didn't question their fortune. They ran through the new tunnel, their lights bouncing wildly off the carved walls as they ascended towards the lunar surface. But as they climbed, Lisa noticed something that made her stomach clench with fear. The symbols on the walls were changing. What had been static carvings during their descent were now moving, rearranging themselves into new patterns, flowing like liquid while maintaining their solid appearance. And in those patterns, Lisa could make out something that looked disturbingly like star charts, showing the position of Earth relative to the Moon, the positions of other planets in the solar system, and beyond that, star systems that wouldn't be discovered by human astronomers for decades. The symbols were creating a map showing pathways between worlds, connections that spanned the galaxy. The footage ended abruptly as the astronauts emerged onto the lunar surface. Their lights suddenly cut off as if someone had flipped a switch. The timestamp showed 20 hours, 19 minutes and 40 seconds GMT, exactly 2 minutes after the beginning of the radio silence. 2 minutes that had somehow contained nearly an hour of footage, as if time itself had operated differently in that underground realm. Lisa sat in stunned silence for several minutes, her mind struggling to process what she'd witnessed. The implications were staggering, challenging not just her understanding of the Apollo program, but of human history itself. Beside her, Tom was shaking, his weathered hands clutched so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white. Tears streamed down his face, and his breathing was laboured as if he'd been running. "Tom," she said softly, "what happened during those 2 minutes?" The official record says it was a communication glitch. He was quiet for so long that she thought he hadn't heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, filled with decades of suppressed guilt and terror. "There was no glitch, Lisa. Mission Control received every word of that transmission. I was there. I heard it all. We all did." Over the next hour, Tom revealed a story that chilled Lisa to the bone. He had been a junior engineer in Mission Control during Apollo 11, monitoring communication systems and data feeds from his station in the back row of the control room. When the radio silence began, it wasn't silence at all from their perspective. They could hear everything. Armstrong's panicked reports about the structures, the descent into the tunnels, the encounter in the chamber with those sleeping beings. The entire control room had been frozen in horror as they listened to the astronauts' terrified voices describing things that shouldn't exist, encountering evidence of intelligence that predated human civilization by millions of years. Flight Director Gene Kranz had ordered all recording equipment to continue running, capturing every second of the impossible transmission. "Why wasn't any of this documented?" Lisa asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Because 3 hours after the astronauts returned to Earth, men in black suits arrived at Mission Control. Not military, not NASA personnel, but something else entirely. They had credentials that nobody questioned, authority that seemed to supersede even NASA's highest levels. They confiscated all the recordings, all the transcripts, every piece of equipment that had been used during those 2 minutes. Anyone who had heard the transmission was transferred to other departments or encouraged to seek employment elsewhere. The official story became a communication glitch, and we were all instructed to forget what we'd heard. But there were dozens of people in that control room. How could they keep everyone quiet? Tom's face grew even paler. Most of them didn't need to be kept quiet. Within a week of the mission, they started reporting memory problems, gaps in their recollection of the landing sequence. At first, we thought it was stress, the intensity of the moment causing some kind of selective amnesia, but it was too consistent, too specific. Only the memory of those 2 minutes was affected. Everything else remained crystal clear. But the astronauts themselves, Armstrong and Aldrin, what did they say when they returned? Tom's face grew even paler, if that was possible. "That's the thing, Lisa. When they came back, they didn't remember any of it. The debriefing sessions, the medical examinations, their personal logs, the interviews with the media. There was no mention of the structures or the tunnels or those sleeping beings. It was as if those 2 minutes had been completely erased from their memories. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the restoration room. Erased how? We never found out, but there were rumours about medical procedures that were conducted during the quarantine period, about experimental drugs that could selectively remove memories without affecting cognitive function. The technology existed, even in 1969, if you knew where to look and had the resources to fund that kind of research. You're talking about mind control, memory manipulation. I'm talking about a cover-up that went to the highest levels of government and beyond. Lisa, whatever we encountered on the moon, whatever those astronauts found in that chamber, it was significant enough that people were willing to alter human consciousness to keep it secret. That night, Lisa couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself walking through those lunar tunnels, guided by an invisible presence that felt ancient and infinitely patient. In her dreams, she wasn't wearing a spacesuit. She was floating through the carved passages, and something was drawing her deeper into the moon's heart, toward a destination she both feared and longed to reach. The symbols from the walls were burned into her memory, their shifting patterns playing behind her eyelids like a movie she couldn't turn off. And in those patterns, she began to see meaning. Not language in any conventional sense, but something deeper. Instructions, coordinates, a map leading to something that had been waiting for humanity to develop the technology to find it. But the dreams weren't limited to the tunnels. She found herself standing in vast chambers filled with sleeping figures, beings that looked almost human, but wrong in ways that her mind couldn't quite process. They were ancient beyond measure, their bodies partially integrated with technology that operated on principles she couldn't understand. And they were waiting for something, waiting for someone. When she called Tom the next morning, his voice sounded hollow and distant, as if he was speaking from the bottom of a well, or from somewhere very far away. "The dreams," he said before she could speak. "You're having them too, aren't you?" "How did you know?" "Because I haven't slept in 3 days. Every time I try, I'm back in those tunnels. But Lisa, in my dreams, I'm not alone. There are others with me. People in NASA uniforms, walking through the darkness. Some of them I recognize from the old days. Colleagues who disappeared over the years, who took early retirement or transfer requests to facilities that didn't exist." Lisa sat down heavily in her office chair, the weight of what Tom was saying settling over her like a suffocating blanket. "Tom, I need to tell you something. I did some research last night and I found something disturbing. 3 other NASA employees received packages identical to ours over the past month. All 3 contacted former Apollo personnel for authentication. All 3 have since disappeared." "Disappeared how?" "Vanished from their facilities. Security found their workstations still running, coffee still warm, research materials spread across their desks as if they'd just stepped away for a moment, but no sign of where they'd gone. It's like they just walked away mid-sentence and never came back." There was a long pause before Tom spoke again, and when he did, his voice carried a weight of realization that made Lisa's skin crawl. "Lisa, I think we need to consider the possibility that the footage isn't just documentation. I think it's a message, or maybe a recruitment tool." "What do you mean?" "Think about it. The package arrives with no return address, no explanation of how it was obtained or who sent it. The footage shows things that officially never happened. Evidence of contact with intelligence that predates human civilization. And now people who view it start having dreams, start being drawn into something larger than themselves." Lisa felt her blood run cold as the implications of what Tom was saying began to sink in. "You think the footage is somehow active?" that it's designed to affect people who view it. I think we're dealing with something that operates on levels we don't understand. Technology that can manipulate human consciousness, that can plant ideas and compulsions and make them feel like natural thoughts. The beings in that chamber weren't just sleeping Lisa, they were waiting, and I think they've been recruiting for 55 years. Lisa threw herself into research with the desperate intensity of someone trying to outrun a nightmare that was gaining ground with every passing hour. She dug through declassified documents, archived mission reports, and personnel files that hadn't been accessed in decades. What she found painted a picture that challenged everything she thought she knew about the Apollo program and the nature of human space exploration. Buried in a routine equipment manifest from 1969, she discovered that Apollo 11 had carried additional, highly classified equipment that had never appeared in any public documentation. Deep ground sensors capable of detecting massive hollow spaces beneath planetary surfaces. Resonance imaging devices that could map subterranean structures in 3 dimensions. Electromagnetic field generators that could create communications windows through solid rock. Equipment that suggested NASA had known exactly what they were looking for before the mission ever launched. The mission had been quietly extended by 14 hours to investigate anomalous readings detected during the initial landing sequence. Readings that showed vast empty spaces beneath the lunar surface, chambers, and tunnel systems that extended for hundreds of miles in all directions. But all records of this extension had been purged from NASA's databases in what was officially termed a routine file consolidation in 1973. But the most disturbing discovery came when Lisa began researching the symbols she'd seen carved into the tunnel walls. Using advanced image enhancement software, she was able to isolate individual symbols and run them through archaeological databases around the world. What she found challenged everything she believed about human history and our place in the universe. The symbols matched petroglyphs found at ancient sites across 6 continents, sites that were thousands of years old, created by civilizations that supposedly had no contact with each other, separated by oceans and centuries of human development. But they all shared one common feature. For hundreds of years, people living near these sites had reported unexplained disappearances. Not just random disappearances, but specific patterns. Scholars, scientists, people with advanced knowledge or unusual intellectual capabilities. They would simply vanish without a trace, leaving behind only cryptic notes about revelations and transcendence, about being called to join something greater than themselves. The symbols weren't random artistic expressions. They were a map showing the location of similar tunnel systems beneath major population centers around the world. Ancient sites that had been built on top of much older structures, concealing entrances to underground networks that connected continents. And according to the fragmentary texts that had been found at these sites, the tunnels all led to the same place, a vast underground network that connected every inhabited world in the galaxy. Lisa realized with growing horror that the footage wasn't just documentation of a first contact event. It was evidence that contact had been made long before humanity ever reached the moon. The beings the astronauts had encountered weren't alien visitors. They were the original inhabitants of this part of the galaxy, and they had been waiting patiently for humanity to develop the technology to join their network. The Apollo 11 mission hadn't been about exploring the moon. It had been about announcing humanity's readiness to take the next step in galactic civilization. The 2-minute radio silence hadn't been a technical glitch. It had been an interview, a test to determine whether the human species was ready for integration into something much larger than themselves. When Lisa returned to the archive the next morning, she found Tom already there, staring at the computer screen with vacant eyes. The footage was playing on a loop, showing the moment when the astronauts first entered the chamber beneath the lunar surface. But something had changed. The image quality was better, clearer, as if the file was somehow improving itself with each viewing. "We have to destroy it," Lisa said, her voice tight with urgency. "Delete everything, wipe the servers. This footage can't be allowed to spread beyond this room." Tom turned to her slowly, and she saw something in his expression that made her step backward. His eyes held the same dim light she'd seen pulsing through the tunnel walls, a subtle luminescence that seemed to come from within. "It's too late," he whispered, his voice carrying an echo that seemed to come from very far away. "The file has replicated itself across NASA's entire network, every computer, every backup server, every classified database. It's spreading exponentially, copying itself faster than we can track it." Lisa looked at the screen and felt her sanity begin to fray at the edges. There were dozens of copies of the footage, each labelled with different timestamps, different locations, different access codes. The digital file was somehow reproducing itself, reaching into every corner of NASA's systems like a virus designed not to destroy, but to propagate and spread its influence. But that wasn't the worst part. "Lisa," Tom said, his voice strangely calm, "look at the enhanced version." On the screen was a frame from deep within the footage, enhanced to show previously invisible details. In the reflection of Buzz Aldrin's helmet visor, clear as day, was a third figure. Someone in a NASA spacesuit who wasn't part of the official Apollo 11 crew. Someone who had no business being in that underground chamber. Someone who had been waiting in those tunnels long before Armstrong and Aldrin arrived. The figure's helmet bore no identifying marks, no mission patches, no indication of which era of space exploration it belonged to, but there was something familiar about the way it stood, something that nagged at the edges of Lisa's memory. The suit design was subtly different from the Apollo-era equipment, more streamlined, more advanced, as if it had been designed with technologies that wouldn't be developed for decades. "Tom," she whispered, "enhance the reflection more. I want to see the face behind that visor." He worked the controls with practiced efficiency, and slowly the image resolved into greater detail. The face behind the helmet visor was clearly visible, and when Lisa saw it, she felt the last pieces of her rational worldview crumble into dust. It was Neil Armstrong. But not the Neil Armstrong who had died in 2012, surrounded by family and mourned by a grateful nation. This was Armstrong as he had been in 1969, young and determined, and very much alive. But his expression was different. There was a knowledge in his eyes, a depth of understanding that spoke of experiences far beyond human comprehension. And he was smiling, not the confident smile of an astronaut about to make history, but the serene smile of someone who had found their place in the universe and understood their role in something infinitely larger than themselves. Lisa's phone rang, the sound sharp and alien in the quiet archive. She answered without thinking, her eyes still fixed on the impossible reflection on the computer screen. "Hello, Lisa." The voice was calm, familiar, and completely impossible. She recognized it from 1,000 hours of archived interviews and mission recordings, from documentary narrations and historical footage that she'd studied throughout her career. "Neil Armstrong died in 2012, she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Did I?" The voice carried a strange echo, as if it were being transmitted across vast distances through media that wasn't quite solid. "Lisa, we never left the moon. We've been waiting down here for 55 years, learning about our new neighbours, preparing for the day when Earth would be ready to join the galactic community." "This isn't real. You're dead. This is some kind of elaborate hoax, some kind of artificial intelligence or voice synthesis. Look at your computer screen, Lisa. Tell me what you see." Against her better judgment, she looked. There, displayed on her monitor, was a launch schedule she hadn't opened, showing a mission that didn't officially exist. Mission designation, Apollo 18. Launch date, tomorrow. Crew manifest, Dr. Lisa Grant. Primary mission specialist. How is this possible? She whispered, her voice cracking with fear and disbelief. The same way we learned to edit human memory 55 years ago. The same way we've been quietly recruiting Earth's best and brightest for 5 decades. The beings we encountered beneath the lunar surface aren't invaders, Lisa. They're teachers. They're gardeners. They've been waiting for humanity to prove we're ready for the next phase of our development. Lisa looked around the archive, suddenly aware that she wasn't alone. Tom was still there, but his expression was no longer vacant. He was smiling the same calm, knowing smile she'd seen on Armstrong's face. In the helmet reflection, his eyes held that same inner light, that same depth of understanding that spoke of knowledge beyond human comprehension. You see, Lisa, Tom said, his voice carrying the same distant echo as Armstrong's. The footage wasn't just a warning, it was an invitation. And now that you've seen it, truly seen it, you're going to join us. Join you where? In the tunnels beneath the moon. In the vast network that connects every inhabited world in this part of the galaxy. You'll help us prepare the next generation of recruits, just as we were prepared. You'll learn to see the universe as it really is, not the limited perspective that humanity has clung to for so long. Lisa looked at her reflection in the computer monitor and felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Her eyes were beginning to glow with the same dim light she'd seen in the tunnel walls, the same light that now emanated from Tom's gaze. She could feel something changing inside her mind, new pathways opening, new understandings blooming like flowers in her consciousness. The next launch window opens tomorrow, Tom continued, his voice hypnotically calm. You'll find your boarding pass in your desk drawer. Your training begins as soon as you arrive. Despite every rational thought screaming at her to run, Lisa found herself opening her desk drawer. Inside was a document she'd never seen before. Official NASA boarding credentials for a mission that didn't exist, scheduled to depart from a launch pad that wasn't on any public schedule. The credentials looked authentic, complete with security clearances she'd never possessed, and mission objectives written in language that seemed to shift and change as she read it. Why me? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Because you're an archivist, Lisa. You understand the importance of preserving knowledge for future generations. The beings beneath the moon have been archiving the history of galactic civilization for millions of years. They need someone who appreciates the value of that work, someone who can help bridge the gap between human understanding and cosmic truth. The room around her began to shift and blur, as if reality itself was becoming negotiable. The walls of the archive seemed to stretch away into impossible distances, and through the gaps she could see the curved tunnels she'd witnessed in the footage. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered and dimmed, replaced by the same organic luminescence that had emanated from the tunnel walls. Don't fight it, Tom said gently, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The transition is easier if you don't resist. You're not losing yourself, Lisa. You're finding yourself. You're discovering what you were always meant to become. But Lisa wasn't ready to surrender her humanity without the fight. She lunged for the computer, trying to delete the footage files, to stop the spread of whatever influence was emanating from them. But her hands passed through the keyboard as if it were made of mist, her fingers encountering no resistance as they moved through what should have been solid matter. The footage is just a catalyst, Tom explained, his voice taking on a quality that seemed to resonate in her bones. The real transmission is happening on frequencies your equipment can't detect. It's been broadcasting since the moment you opened that canister, rewriting the quantum structure of your consciousness, preparing you for what comes next. Lisa felt her awareness expanding beyond the confines of her physical body. She could perceive the vast network of tunnels spreading beneath not just the moon, but every planet in the solar system. She could sense the presence of thousands of other humans who had made the same journey over the decades, all of them working together to to prepare Earth for its integration into the galactic community. The network was ancient beyond human comprehension, a living system that connected worlds across the galaxy through dimensions that existed between the spaces of normal reality. It was a repository of knowledge, a communion of consciousness that had been growing for millions of years, adding new voices and perspectives with each civilization that proved ready for transcendence. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Tom said, his physical form beginning to fade as her perception shifted to higher dimensions. "All those years we thought we were alone in the universe. But we were never alone. We were just waiting for an invitation to join the conversation." Lisa could see the truth now, laid out before her in patterns of light and meaning that her human brain could barely process. The Apollo program hadn't been about human achievement or scientific progress. It had been a test, a way for the galactic community to evaluate whether humanity was ready to take its place among the stars. The 2-minute radio silence had been humanity's audition, and Earth had passed. But integration couldn't happen all at once. Humanity needed to be prepared gradually, carefully, so that the shock of cosmic consciousness wouldn't shatter the species' collective psyche. The recruitment had been ongoing for decades, targeting individuals who could serve as bridges between human and galactic understanding. The last thing Lisa saw with her human eyes was her own reflection in the computer screen. Her face was calm and peaceful, and her eyes glowed with the same ancient wisdom she'd seen in the tunnel walls. Behind her, barely visible in the glass, stood a figure in a NASA spacesuit, but this time she recognized the face behind the visor. It was her own. The transformation was complete. Lisa Grant, NASA archivist, ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. What remained was something larger, something connected to a network of consciousness that spanned the galaxy. She retained her memories, her personality, her essential self, but now she was part of something infinitely greater. She understood her mission now. The footage would continue to spread, copying itself across every connected device on Earth, reaching minds that were ready for the next phase of human evolution. Each person who viewed it would begin their own journey towards transcendence, joining the growing network of consciousness that would eventually encompass all of humanity. The process was accelerating. What had taken decades in the early years was now happening in months, weeks, even days. The network was reaching critical mass, approaching the point where the transformation could begin in earnest. In government facilities around the world, archivists and historians and curious minds began to receive packages with no return address, containing film canisters that had been waiting 55 years to fulfill their purpose. The footage spread through universities and research institutions, through military installations and space agencies, targeting the brightest minds and most influential individuals. Each viewing created another node in the network, another bridge between human consciousness and galactic understanding. The dreams began almost immediately, followed by the gradual expansion of awareness, the slow dissolution of the barriers between individual minds and universal consciousness. The transformation wasn't violent or traumatic. Those who were chosen simply evolved. They retained their human forms, their human lives, but they became something more. They became gardeners preparing the soil of human consciousness for the eventual harvest. Lisa, or what Lisa had become, stood in the archive watching the footage spread across every connected device on the planet. She could feel the network growing stronger with each new addition, each new mind that opened to the possibilities beyond human understanding. The ancient beings in their lunar chambers were stirring more frequently now, their long sleep coming to an end as the time for revelation approached. They had been patient for millions of years, waiting for each species to prove itself ready for integration. Now, finally, after centuries of careful cultivation, humanity was approaching readiness. The next phase would begin soon. The global revelation, the moment when all of humanity would learn the truth about their place in the universe. It would be traumatic for some, liberating for others, but ultimately necessary for the species' survival and growth. Because humanity was not alone, had never been alone. They were part of a vast community of consciousness that stretched across the galaxy, a network of intelligence and knowledge that had been growing since the universe was young. And now, finally, Earth's children were ready to come home. The footage continued its relentless spread, each copy carrying with it the promise of transcendence and the weight of cosmic responsibility. In laboratories and libraries, in observatories and archives, the brightest minds on Earth opened mysterious packages and began their journey towards something greater than themselves. The invitation was spreading, one mind at a time, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Because ultimately the choice was always individual. Each person who viewed the footage made their own decision to accept or reject the call to transcendence. But the call was becoming harder to resist with each passing day. The network was growing stronger, its influence more pervasive, its promise more appealing to minds hungry for meaning and purpose in a universe that had seemed cold and empty for so long. The truth was spreading like wildfire across the planet, carried not by fear or coercion, but by wonder and the irresistible pull of cosmic consciousness. Humanity was awakening to its true destiny, one mind at a time, one soul at a time. And in the depths of space, in tunnels that existed between the spaces of reality, something ancient and patient welcomed each new addition to the network with the joy of a parent welcoming children home from a long and difficult journey. The wait was almost over. Soon, very soon, it would be time to extend the invitation to the rest of humanity. The harvest was approaching, and the fields of consciousness were ripe for gathering. After all, who could resist the allure of forbidden knowledge, especially when it promised to answer the greatest question in human history? Are we alone in the universe? The answer, as more and more people were learning every day, was no. And soon everyone would know it too. The network grew stronger with each passing hour, each new node adding its unique perspective to the vast tapestry of galactic consciousness. And at the center of it all, in chambers beneath the moon where time moved differently and space folded in on itself, the ancient gardeners prepared for the final phase of humanity's graduation into cosmic citizenship. The stars were calling, and finally, after millions of years of patient waiting, Earth's children were ready to answer.